A couple of weeks ago, I released a 1-minute silent video demonstrating why so many veteran Linux system administrators hate, or rather hated, SystemD. Over the past few years, I have encountered a handful of Linux users who are surprised to find I dislike SystemD. I've also seen Linux content creators try to explain why some people dislike SystemD. While much of what they say is true, they consistently leave out the serious issues. I believe they are people of goodwill, so this puzzled me. Until I realized they are relatively new to Linux. They were not using Linux, certainly not professionally, when SystemD was first released. So I decided to do a video giving my perspective. As someone who has used Linux for nearly 2 decades, and professionally for almost 15 years. My first encounter with SystemD went very much like the short I just released. And it did not improve from there. I was rather surprised in the spring of 2019 when I had to use a SystemD distro, Raspbian, and the whole process was not entirely unpleasant. I actually liked some of the design decisions behind SystemD. It was, in fact, enough that I thought maybe I just didn't know enough when I first tried to use SystemD. Maybe it was hardware problems that I blamed on SystemD but weren't SystemD's fault. But there were still some concrete problems in 2019 when I used SystemD. And I figured I'd do a short video highlighting just those problems. So I grabbed the last Debian 8 release and tried to boot it. It failed. And those memories, long suppressed, of just how bad SystemD was, came back. To be blunt, SystemD, when it first launched, was hot garbage. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the problems that plagued early SystemD. Number 7. It's a Red Hat project. I'm not actually worried about this from an ecosystem perspective, although I know some people who are. Sure, Red Hat, and by extension, IBM, has a great deal of influence on Linux. So does Microsoft, to the tune of $500,000 a year to the Linux Foundation. It's worrying, but not a good reason to discount good software. The problem is that Red Hat has never been very good at interacting with the wider Linux community. They do their thing, and everyone else can take it or leave it. Community feedback from anyone not running Red Hat Enterprise Linux is not particularly important to them. That's fair enough. They have to make their money somehow, and their paid customers are the people that matter to them. But maybe, if you're an independent distribution, hitching your init system to them isn't the best idea. Number 6. SystemD is not modular. I'm not talking about SystemD boot, or SystemD nspawn, or any of the other projects under the SystemD brand. I'm talking only about SystemD init, the core boot service, or the core init services. Just take a look at the source code for lognd versus elognd. And you can see the large parts of lognd that are hard to depend on other parts of SystemD. And not through public interfaces or APIs, but directly accessing the internals of other SystemD components. These are not required to provide the login1 interface, but SystemD lognd includes them anyway. Before you say, but it's multiple files, so's the Linux kernel. And I don't think anyone would argue that the Linux kernel is not monolithic. It loads device trees and kernel drivers and firmware files at boot off the disk. It's multiple files. But they all exist within one namespace. They all interact with each other through the same non-public, non-user space facing APIs. And the crucial thing that applies both to the Linux kernel and to SystemD is that you can't easily pull a piece of the Linux kernel out and use it elsewhere. You can't easily replace a piece of the Linux kernel. And actually, it's easier to write a new device for the Linux kernel than to write a replacement for login-D for SystemD, because SystemD is so tightly integrated. Now, it's not a problem to be monolithic. The problem is, first, that SystemD claims not to be, and second, that it's a fast-moving target. So trying in practice to replace pieces of SystemD, to say, you don't like it, replace it, doesn't work so well, because it's not modular. These are the problems that other people regularly cite, although, as I said, in both cases, they're often underestimated in severity. The remaining 5 problems aren't as severe as they used to be, but these were the real problems facing SystemD when it first launched. Number 5, SystemD is not sys5 init compatible. This should not be a serious problem. After all, OS X, Windows, other operating systems don't use sys5 init, and we don't complain, even when we have to use those systems. But it is a problem because SystemD claims to be sys5 init compatible. And in a handful of cases, it's semi-sys5 init compatible. The way you create a system file, a system service under SystemD, is to put a service file in etc systemd system. The way you create a service under sys5 init is to put a service file, an init script, in etc init.d. The problem is, if you have both, the script in etc init.d is silently ignored. To demonstrate the problem, we go into etc init.d. You can see that SSH here has been modified. We go down to where it says start. Case 1, start. I started with via init.d, write that out to temp sshd. Let's go ahead and reboot. This problem, when I first encountered it, now if we look in boot, or in temp, there's no ssh.txt here. That change to the init script is silently ignored. I spent half a day trying to figure that out when I first started running SystemD. Problem number 4 is closely related. SystemD does not provide a predictable or even a consistent boot order. I've created a set of 5 demo services. All they do is run a small program that writes the argument into a temp file. All 5 of these services have been set to run on startup. No, the first service has been set to run on startup. Yep. And with each one that I run, it gives an error, because that's early SystemD for you. But now when we restart, it's important to note that even though it returned with an error, it actually worked. So all 5 services will start now. Anytime. I wonder if it's a race condition on shutdown, because that's problem number 3. Honestly, this is painful to use. And just to be clear, this is a brand new install of Debian 8. I didn't make any changes, nothing that should be causing the random instability problems. Like that. Well, it's sufficient to demonstrate the problem. I don't know why demo 1 isn't running. So we copy that into our home folder and we restart. As you can see, the order that the services started changed. Now, it is possible to explicitly set the order. Or rather, it's possible in a chain like this. You can make demo 2 depend on demo 1 and demo 3 depend on demo 2 and so on. The problem is that when SystemD first launched, there were many services, hardware drivers, other random things that didn't have complete dependency trees. And so you would get race conditions on boot. You would get deadlocks, you would get live locks, you would get the system boots, but you don't have your video drivers, or you don't have your audio drivers, or you don't have your network drivers. On one of those servers we had, you'd have to reboot somewhere between 4 and 10 times before it would come up and everything would work out of the box. And what makes it worse, there's no way, or at least there wasn't at the time, a way to get a list of what services it's trying to start in what order, or to tell it to only run on one core, or whatever it took, because as much as you save time using parallel boot, you lose all that time if you have to reboot the system one extra time. Problem number 3. If you haven't seen the video from a couple of weeks ago on Friday, it'll be in the description below. But in summary, brand new Debian 8 live CD, the last version of Debian 8 to get a live CD. So it should be as up to date as Debian 8 ever got. More polished, more up to date than when SystemD first shipped. Using identical settings to the Debian 7 CD, the Debian 8 system fails to boot. It comes up, it starts X11, it tries to start GNOME and crashes. And it tries to restart and crashes. And that's it. You're done. If you're on physical hardware or whatever, you can maybe get to a TTY and figure something out, but your graphics drivers are just broken out of the box. Is it SystemD's fault? Maybe. Maybe not. Could have been the graphics drivers. It's not GNOME 3, because Debian 7 used GNOME 3 as well. Whatever it was, SystemD was the headline feature, and exactly that experience. You do an upgrade, you try to do a fresh install, and it just doesn't work. And at the end of the day, that was the most common complaint I got from my coworkers trying to run SystemD systems, is that it just doesn't work. But you'll note that that's problem 3. That's not even the most severe problem, because that's why sysadmins exist, is to figure out why that kind of thing doesn't work and to fix it. To work around broken parts of the system so that the end users who aren't sysadmins don't have to. So what's worse than being broken out of the box? Well, problem number 2 is that the documentation for SystemD is incomplete, inconsistent, out of date, and in at least some cases was never right. The obvious solution to most of these problems is to read the manual, RTFM. But that only works if the manual is correct. I run a dual seat machine, just to give an example, using eLoginD, PAM, etc. I do not use a login manager, because when I first set up the system, no login manager could handle multiple Wayland instances. So the question is how to initialize seat 1. Seat 0 is the default. The documentation on freedesktop.org has recently been updated, May of 2021, but it is still incomplete. Previously, it was flat wrong. It claimed that login-D is responsible for assigning seats to processes, which it never did. Now it says you should take possession of each seat by spawning your greeter on it. How? No clue. Later, it says you can start Xorg on a seat by passing the seat flag to it. But that assumes you're running X. In truth, seat management is done entirely through PAM, with some utility functions available via login-D or elogin-D to get the current seat. Bottom line, the documentation for this on freedesktop.org was never correct. And that's just one example. The documentation claiming that it's sys5 init compatible. Not bothering to announce breaking changes with point releases, and so on. And this brings us to the number one problem, the biggest problem, which is closely related to the poor documentation. When we first tried to move to a SystemD distro, and it didn't work, and we started looking for the cause, and we started trying to reach out to the developers and trying to file bug reports and so on. Questions, concerns, bug reports, other negative feedback about SystemD was met with gaslighting. Some change with SystemD would break something, or someone would file a bug report, and often the response was some variation of, you misconfigured something. Not, you misconfigured this and go fix it, but just generic, it's your fault, you did something wrong. It's not our bug, or it's a feature. This got so bad that Pottering, the man behind SystemD, got his Linux kernel Git access revoked after breaking user space one too many times and refusing to take responsibility. At the time, we joked that SystemD is trivially bug-free, because a bug is when software doesn't meet its spec, doesn't do what it says it does, and SystemD had no spec. This ties into the complaint about modularity. It's all well and good to say SystemD is modular, don't like it, replace bits of it. But when you don't have a specification, when one point release can break internal interfaces, no one can take that seriously. Just to avoid any confusion, these problems have been mostly resolved. The reason content creators now only talk about problems 6 and 7 is that those are the biggest problems with modern SystemD. The project is slowed down enough that third-party documentation is reasonably complete. Service files have mostly complete dependency graphs. You can get tutorials on how to write system files, service files. So boot races are rare, and the live CD, the modern live CD, actually boots to X11. Do I use SystemD? Yes, for virtual machines and the like. Do I like SystemD? Not really. OpenRC took most of the best ideas from SystemD and did them better, and without the major early pain points. For a lot of us veteran sysadmins, SystemD just has a bad history.